At dawn, the fog was so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The sea was flat as glass, and the only sounds were the low cries of gulls and the slow rhythm of waves breaking against black volcanic rock. Then, from somewhere above that blanket of gray, came a sound that didn't belong to the morning, the hum of engines, deep and steady, like a storm hiding in the clouds. The first man to notice it was Corporal Alan Hughes, standing guard outside a wooden barracks on the edge of the Dutch Harbor base, on Alaska Island, June 3, 1942. He squinted into the fog. "That's not ours," he whispered. Seconds later, the first explosion. The blast tore through the sky, shaking the barracks to splinters. Sirens wailed. Men stumbled out half-dressed, rifles in hand, not yet believing what was happening. Then came the second explosion, closer this time, from the oil tanks near the harbor. Flames leapt into the fog like sudden sunrise. Enemy aircraft sighted over Dutch Harbor. Repeat, enemy aircraft sighted. The radio operator's voice cracked through static. In the confusion, someone shouted, "They can't reach this far north. It's impossible." But the impossible had already arrived. Japanese A-6M0 fighters and twin-engine bombers swept low over the harbor, diving out of the clouds, dropping their payloads, vanishing again into the fog as quickly as they'd appeared. For a moment, there was nothing, just the ringing of ears and the smell of burning fuel. Then the whine of another dive, the rattle of machine guns ripping through air. A nurse running between the barracks fell face-first into the mud. Another man shouted for a medic who would never answer. It wasn't supposed to happen here. Not on American soil. Inside the command bunker, Major William Price slammed his hand on the map table. "They're testing us," he said. "After Midway, they're coming for the Aleutians next." No one argued. They could hear it in the distance, the faint, constant hum of engines circling like vultures. The Japanese attack on Dutch Harbor lasted less than half an hour that morning, but by the time the planes disappeared into the fog, the base was on fire. Fuel tanks burned for hours. Ammunition stores exploded one after another, scattering metal across the harbor. From the cliffs above, fishermen watched, too stunned to move. In the small hospital on the hill, a young medic named Sam Carter tried to keep his hands steady as he wrapped a tourniquet around a pilot's leg. "Where are they from?" someone asked. Carter didn't look up. "The ocean," he said. "Like ghosts." By noon, the attack had ended. The sky cleared just enough for the men to see what was left: smoking hangars, twisted aircraft, and the scattered wreckage of 2 Japanese planes shot down by anti-aircraft fire. One had crashed into the tundra outside the base. The pilot's body, still strapped in the seat, was the first dead enemy soldier ever found on U.S. territory during the war. When the news reached Washington, the reaction was muted. "A minor incident," the report read. "Limited casualties." To the men at Dutch Harbor, it didn't feel minor. That night, the fog returned. The flames died, but the air still smelled of oil and blood. In the distance, the faint orange glow of another fire flickered on the horizon, on a different island. Private Hughes wrote in his journal that evening, "I keep listening for the engines. I think I'll hear them again. Maybe tomorrow." He was right. At dawn on June 4th, the bombers came again, heavier, louder, more precise. The Americans fired back blindly into the fog, shells bursting somewhere unseen. Japanese bullets tore through the docks, the mess hall, the hospital roof. By mid-morning, the air raid sirens had gone silent, not because the danger had passed, but because the power lines were gone. When the attack finally ended, the men climbed out from their shelters, dazed. The fog had swallowed the planes again. In total, 43 Americans were dead, 50 wounded. The Japanese lost fewer than a dozen men. But something far greater had shifted, an invisible line. For the first time since 1812, a foreign power had attacked American soil. As the fires burned into the night, Hughes stood at the edge of the harbor, rifle slung over his shoulder, watching the dark waves. Somewhere out there, beyond the fog, the enemy was landing on other islands, Attu, Kiska, places most Americans had never even heard of. He felt the wind pick up and whispered, "It's our land now." But for how long? The radio crackled behind him, carrying a single, clipped message from command: "Prepare for counterattack." And in the cold, gray silence of the Aleutians, the war had truly come home. Because what started as an air raid was only the beginning. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. In Washington, they called it a minor threat. For the men who lived through it, it was the edge of the world, and hell froze over. The Aleutian Islands stretched like a jagged spine across the North Pacific, a chain of black rock and wind where even birds seemed reluctant to land. After the Japanese strike on Dutch Harbor, the U.S. military began fortifying every inch they could hold. Thousands of men were shipped north, soldiers, engineers, medics, all told that it would be temporary duty. None of them were ready for what awaited. Fog rolled in like a living thing, swallowing mountains whole. The air never stopped moving, slicing through tents, uniforms, even skin. The temperature barely rose above freezing, even in summer. It wasn't just cold, it was wet, endless cold, the kind that gnawed into bones and never let go. Private James Clark wrote home on July 7, 1942. "We haven't seen the sun in weeks. The ground eats our boots. The wind eats our nerves." He ended the letter with a single line that censors let pass. "This place feels like the edge of nowhere." The men quickly learned that the enemy wasn't only human. It was the island itself. Boots rotted, rifles jammed from salt and rust. Food froze before they could eat it. A soldier could die simply walking to the latrine, buried by snow or lost in fog so thick he couldn't see his own outstretched hand. They called it the Forgotten Front. Newspapers rarely mentioned it. Radio reports skipped over it. The big stories were in Africa, Italy, France, not on two wind-beaten islands no one could even find on a map. But the Japanese hadn't forgotten. After the Dutch harbor raid, they landed troops on Attu and Kiska, American territory. When word reached Washington, most dismissed it. Two uninhabited rocks, one senator said. But they weren't uninhabited anymore. For the first time in over a century, foreign soldiers stood on American soil. In response, the U.S. Army began its slow, brutal crawl back across the Aleutians. Bases sprang up on Adak, Mchitka, and Umnak, names the soldiers could barely pronounce. Supplies came by sea when the weather allowed. When it didn't, the men went hungry. Captain Robert Hall, a field engineer, wrote in his diary, "We build runways on land that won't stay still. Every morning, the wind tears away what we built the day before. It's like fighting ghosts." The Japanese had entrenched themselves deep into the fog, building bunkers and tunnels across the ridges of Attu and Kiska. Scouts reported seeing movement, shadows behind the mist, flashes of light that vanished before a single shot could be fired. Sometimes the sound of a distant bell echoed across the water, or what might have been one. No one ever found where it came from. By late 1942, frostbite cases outnumbered bullet wounds. Men lost fingers, toes, entire feet. One medic recalled, "I had to choose who got the last dry blanket. I stopped thinking of them as supplies. They were miracles." The isolation broke many. A corporal shot himself after 3 days of blizzard conditions. Another disappeared during patrol, never found again. Some whispered that the fog itself took him. And yet, amid the misery, something strange happened. The men stopped caring about the politics of it all. They stopped asking why they were there. The fight had become simple, not about strategy, not even about victory. Just survival. Each night, the wind roared like an animal outside the tents. Sometimes, it tore them away completely. Men slept clutching their rifles, half from fear of the Japanese, half from the fear of being carried off the mountain by the storm. A radio operator named McIntyre wrote in a letter home, "The weather talks to you here. It whispers things. Sometimes it sounds like the enemy. Sometimes it sounds like home." Still, the men held their ground. They built airstrips, laid wire, set up radar towers that froze over within hours. Each new outpost was another nail in the invisible wall that the U.S. was hammering back across the Pacific. When the first Japanese reconnaissance plane reappeared over the islands, it wasn't the shock it once was. The soldiers barely looked up. "Let them come," one muttered. "At least it'll be something to shoot at." But nothing came. Just more fog, more waiting, more of the island gnawing at their sanity. Command promised reinforcements, but the ships were trapped by storms. By Christmas, the men no longer sang. They huddled around stoves made from fuel drums, trading cigarettes for dry socks. One night, a lone harmonica broke the silence, a tune no one recognized. When it ended, The wind swallowed the sound like it had never existed. By February 1943, word spread that an operation was coming, something big. Rumors said they would finally strike back, take one of the occupied islands. But which one, no one knew. And then the order came. Simple, brutal, final, retake at 2. At any cost. The men packed their rifles, their frozen rations, their fear. They didn't cheer. They didn't even talk. They just nodded, like men walking into the kind of storm that never really ends. The fog thickened around them again that night, curling through the tents like breath. Someone whispered, "They're out there waiting." And they were right. Because when the counterattack began, the enemy wasn't hiding anymore. It was waiting in the mist, with rifles aimed and voices ready to scream. We thought they'd run. Instead, they were waiting. The words came from Sergeant Lewis Hart, written in pencil on a damp, torn field notebook found weeks after the battle. His unit had landed on Attu at dawn, May 11th, 1943, the start of what would become one of the most brutal and least known battles of the Pacific War. When the landing craft hit the beach, the men expected chaos, machine gun fire, mortars, the crack of snipers. But there was only wind. A freezing, relentless wind that cut through every layer of uniform. The fog hung so thick they could barely see the man in front of them. Somewhere beyond that curtain of gray, the Japanese were out there, unseen, unheard, waiting. The first shots didn't come until the second day. A small patrol disappeared into the hills and never came back. When search teams went looking, they found nothing but empty rifles, footprints that led into the mist and stopped abruptly, as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. Then, suddenly, the silence shattered. A burst of machine gun fire tore through the fog. Screams followed, close, then gone. The men hit the ground, firing at shapes they couldn't see. For hours, the shooting came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Attu wasn't just cold, it was alive with death. The ridges were slick with snow and mud. Every step was a struggle, every breath a knife. Soldiers slipped, broke bones, vanished into crevasses. When night fell, the wind screamed through the valleys like voices crying in Japanese. By the end of the first week, the Americans had advanced only a mile inland. They called one ridge Massacre Valley, a name that would soon prove prophetic. Corporal John Parks described it in a letter later found among his effects. "You can't see 10 yards ahead. We crawl through snow and mud. Sometimes you fire because you think you saw movement. Sometimes you fire just to feel alive." The Japanese defense was unlike anything the Americans had faced. There were no front lines, no clear objectives. The enemy hid in tunnels, trenches, and caves dug deep into the volcanic rock. They struck suddenly, then disappeared back into the mountain. And then there was the weather. The temperature dropped below freezing every night. Rifles jammed. Medical kits froze solid. Frostbites spread like infection. Black fingers, white skin, pain that never ended. A medic recalled in his journal, "I treated a man for shock, not from bullets, from the cold." He kept whispering that his hands were gone, but they were still there, just blue and stiff. For 19 days, the battle raged. The fog made air support nearly impossible. Planes dropped bombs blindly, hoping to hit something, anything. Sometimes they hit their own. By the third week, the Japanese resistance was collapsing, but their will had not. The Americans found bodies in shallow foxholes, each with one bullet left. Some soldiers carried grenades clutched to their chests. One officer wrote, "They're not fighting to win. They're fighting to die." On May 29th, just before dawn, it happened. 1,000 Japanese soldiers launched a final charge, the largest banzai attack of the war. They came screaming through the fog with bayonets fixed, some without helmets, others without weapons at all. The Americans opened fire, but they kept coming, wave after wave, their cries echoing across the frozen hills. Men fought with knives, rifle butts, even shovels. One American gunner was found later, still gripping the trigger of his machine gun, his body frozen stiff. Another soldier, bleeding from 3 wounds, said afterward, "I stopped counting. I just kept pulling the trigger until it went quiet." When the sun rose, the snow was red. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Most had killed themselves or each other rather than surrender. The surviving Americans stumbled through the carnage in silence. Some wept. Some laughed. Most just stared. Sergeant Hart wrote his last entry that morning. "We won. but I don't know what that means anymore. The cost was staggering. 549 Americans killed, 1,200 wounded, and nearly 2,000 suffering from frostbite, trench foot, or exposure. Of the Japanese garrison, almost none survived. When word reached Washington, the headlines were triumphant. @2 liberated. American soil free again. But those who had been there knew better. They hadn't taken back an island. They had traded it for their sanity. As the fog lifted for the first time in weeks, the men could finally see the sea, gray, endless, indifferent. The wind carried no sound now, no cries, no gunfire. Just the hollow echo of what had been. One soldier, staring out across the waves, whispered, "We fought the ghosts, and they won." But the war in the Aleutians wasn't over. Because somewhere out there, hidden behind another wall of fog, one more island still belonged to the enemy, and it was waiting. Kiska, the last Japanese stronghold on American soil. The order was simple. We take it back. No one questioned it. No one imagined that the enemy was already gone. It was August 15th, 1943. 35,000 American and Canadian troops stood in landing craft, their faces wrapped in scarves, rifles pressed against their chests. The fog was so thick it felt solid, like they were sailing into smoke. The Aleutian wind screamed over the water, snapping the flags so hard they sounded like gunshots. The men waited for the storm of bullets that never came. The first boots hit the beach at 6:30 a.m. The silence was wrong. Too clean. Too still. One lieutenant whispered, "They're waiting." His words vanished into the mist. The soldiers spread out, creeping up the rocky slopes, fingers on triggers. Then, a boom. Somewhere behind them, a mine went off. Screams echoed through the fog. Others returned fire instinctively, though there was no target. Machine guns rattled. Mortars thudded into the hills. The fog amplified every sound until the entire island seemed to be alive with battle. But there was no enemy. For 2 days, the men fought shadows. Explosions from booby traps planted weeks earlier echoed like return fire. Nervous gunners fired at silhouettes that were nothing more than rocks or drifting smoke. Squads disappeared into the mist and stumbled into crossfire from their own side. By nightfall, the beaches were slick with mud and confusion. On the third day, a Canadian patrol reached the high ridge overlooking the bay. They expected to see Japanese defenses, machine gun nests, anti-aircraft positions. Instead, they saw nothing but ruins, empty bunkers, discarded rifles, and the faint smell of old smoke. A radio operator picked up a signal, static, then silence. No Japanese voices, no commands. They found rice bowls still half full, bedding still warm. Even the guard posts were manned by ghosts, rifles propped neatly on logs, helmets resting on stones as if their owners would return any minute. What no one knew was that the Japanese had evacuated Kiska 2 weeks earlier, on July 28th. In an extraordinary naval operation, submarines and destroyers had slipped through the fog and taken every last soldier off the island. Not one American had noticed, but the men who landed didn't know that. And so the battle for Kiska became one of the strangest, most tragic episodes of the war, a fight against fear, echo, and their own imagination. Private Thomas McNeil described it later in a letter home. "We fired for hours at nothing. The fog made ghosts out of everything. You start to believe they're still here, hiding, breathing down your neck. But when you go to look, there's no one." The cost of that illusion was terrible. Over 300 Allied soldiers died, killed by friendly fire, by mines, by accidents in the fog. Entire platoons were wiped out by panic. A Canadian officer, thinking he was under attack, called artillery on his own position. When the smoke cleared, he was the only one left alive. "We fought a ghost army," McNeil wrote. And the ghosts won. When the fog finally lifted 5 days later, Kiska stood silent. The land was scarred, the beaches littered with shells and twisted metal, but no enemy bodies. Not one. The realization spread slowly through the ranks like sickness. Men who had fought with every ounce of courage now felt only emptiness. Captain Roy Henders, one of the first to reach the island's main ridge, said later in an interview, "I don't think I've ever felt so defeated. You can't win when the enemy's already gone." The reports that went back to Washington were careful. "Operation successful," they read. No enemy resistance encountered. There was no mention of the friendly fire, the panic, or the men buried on a battlefield that had never truly existed. In the weeks that followed, engineers built airstrips and supply depots on Kiska. The war moved south toward the Pacific, toward Tarawa and the Marianas. The Aleutians were no longer news. But for the men who had been there, the silence of that island never left them. They spoke of strange things, whispers in the fog at night, footsteps that stopped when you turned around, the constant sense of being watched. Some refused to sleep indoors after returning home. Others kept waking in the dark, expecting to see the fog closing in again. One chaplain wrote in his journal, "We buried them where the ground was soft enough to dig. It was the first time I prayed over men killed by their own brothers." When the last units sailed away, the island remained still. The fog came back, swallowing everything. In the official photos, Kiska looked peaceful, the perfect victory. But those who knew the truth called it something else, the Ghost Island. And though the Aleutian campaign was finally declared over, its scars ran deeper than anyone understood. The land would heal in time. The minds of the men, not so easily. Because the fog of war wasn't just on the island. It had followed them home. "Dear Mom, you won't hear about us in the papers. They say we're just guarding rocks." The letter was dated February 1944. It came from one of thousands of men left behind on the Aleutian Islands, soldiers who had survived the battles, only to be forgotten by everyone except the wind. After Kiska, the war had moved on. The headlines shouted of Italy, Normandy, and the Pacific. But for the men stationed on Attu, Adak, and Amchitka, the fight never really ended. The Japanese were gone, yet they still stood watch, rifles in hand, staring into fog that hid nothing but their own thoughts. The Aleutians became a place of waiting, a kind of limbo where time slowed, froze, and then stopped altogether. Snow covered the wreckage of war, burying twisted helmets and spent casings. The airstrips built for battle now hosted only gulls. The war, for them, had turned into survival against silence. The days blurred into each other. Patrols trudged through endless mud and snow. Engines groaned under the cold. Coffee froze before it could be drunk. Radios hissed and cracked, but messages rarely came. Supply ship delayed. Weather. Always weather. Inside their barracks, diesel fumes replaced warmth. The men slept in their clothes, blankets stiff with frost. Some carved small notches into the walls to count the weeks. Others stopped counting altogether. Private Carl Simmons wrote in his diary, "The cold talks to you. It whispers things you don't want to hear. Sometimes it sounds like voices from home. Sometimes it sounds like the ones we buried." They called themselves the Men of the Fog. To outsiders, their duty was simple, to guard the edge of America. But to them, it felt like guarding the edge of existence. There were no parades, no medals, no sense of purpose. Just the same wind, the same gray sea, the same horizon that never moved. One man joked that if they stood still long enough, the island would freeze around them and make statues of them all. The enemy they now fought was invisible. Not Japanese soldiers, but isolation, boredom, and the creeping madness that came from endless waiting. They played cards until the decks fell apart, told stories that grew stranger with every retelling. A few painted faces on rocks and gave them names, new recruits, they said. Letters from home arrived months late, if they arrived at all. One came to a man who'd been dead 3 weeks, buried under snow before the mail plane ever landed. At night, the wind screamed through the cracks in the barracks. Some men swore they could still hear the battle, gunfire in the distance, voices shouting in Japanese. But when they went outside, there was only the endless fog and the hollow echo of their own footsteps. It wasn't just the cold that wore them down. It was the forgetting. When newspapers did mention the Aleutians, it was as a footnote. Quiet sector, they called it. Secured. But for those stationed there, quiet was worse than combat. It meant no one cared. Corporal Edward Langley wrote home. You start to wonder, who's the enemy now? The Japanese? Or the sky? The line became something of a saying among them. It summed up the absurdity of it all. Men armed for war, staring day after day into nothing but mist and sea. There were still deaths, not from bullets, but from frostbite, pneumonia, and despair. A sergeant shot himself in his bunk. Another walked into the fog and never came back. When they found him, days later, his rifle was gone. Some said he'd gone to find the enemy. Others said he'd just wanted to disappear. The Red Cross reports painted a bleak picture. morale low, weather severe, men restless. But Washington had no replacements to send. The Pacific was burning, and these outposts were stable. Stable. By the spring of 1945, the war was nearing its end elsewhere. In Europe, cities were falling. In the Pacific, fleets advanced toward Japan. But in the Aleutians, nothing changed. Snow melted into mud, and mud froze back into snow. Some of the men began carving small figures from driftwood, soldiers, ships, crosses. They left them in the tundra, tiny memorials to the things they'd lost and the things they'd never had. When victory was finally announced in August, the news came over a static-filled radio. The men cheered, but it was half-hearted. There were no parades, no flags, just the sound of the wind howling outside. That night, one of them said quietly, "Guess we can go home now." Another replied, "If we remember how." In the weeks that followed, the army began pulling men off the islands. But for some, it was already too late. They had learned to live in the fog, to listen to the silence, to fear what waited beyond it. One final report from the Aleutian Command summed it up best. They survived the enemy, but not the silence. And when the war ended, when the ships came to take them home, no one remembered the battle for Alaska. No medals, no headlines. Just men stepping onto the decks, faces pale from years without sunlight, eyes that looked past the horizon as if searching for something still lost in the mist. But one man couldn't forget. He stood on the edge of the island, binoculars pressed to his eyes, staring across the gray expanse of the Bering Sea. The wind tore at his coat, but he didn't move. "You can see them," he whispered to the young corporal beside him. "The islands of Japan, just beyond the fog." Colonel Everett "Rusty" Smith had been in the Aleutians since the first bombs fell on Dutch Harbor. He'd fought through the fog, through the mud, through the loneliness that felt heavier than any weapon he'd carried. Now, in 1946, long after the war had ended, he was one of the few who remained. The Aleutians were empty again, the bases dismantled, barracks left to rot in the cold. Only a skeleton crew of officers and scientists stayed behind, recording weather, watching the horizon. It should have been peaceful, but peace, Smith discovered, was just another kind of silence. In his final report to the Navy, filed from Adak Station, Smith described the islands not as a battlefield, but as a mirror, one that shows what we fear when the guns stop firing. He wrote in clean, precise sentences, but between the lines was something else: loneliness, reflection, the quiet weight of understanding. The files are still kept in the National Archives. Subject: strategic significance of the Aleutians. But the report reads more like a confession than a military document. "We once thought Alaska was far from the world," Smith wrote. "Turns out, we were standing on its edge. From here, you can almost feel Japan. You can almost see the curve of the Pacific, the way it connects everything we thought was separate." He had seen the war from the end of the earth, from where America began and ended at once. The Japanese had used the Kuril Islands, less than 700 miles away, as launching points for bombers. From Attu, those same islands shimmered faintly on the horizon, unreachable, yet close enough to change how a man saw the world. Smith often walked the coastline alone, notebook in hand. The fog rolled in and out like breath. Seals barked in the distance. Waves broke against the black stones, and the wrecks of forgotten landing craft rusted quietly into the sea. Sometimes, he stopped and stared at what remained. Trenches filled with snow, helmets half buried in moss, a wooden cross leaning sideways in the wind. He'd light a cigarette and whisper, "We fought to prove the land was ours, but it never belonged to anyone." He understood now that the Aleutian campaign had never been about conquest. It had been about perspective, about realizing how thin the line was between home and front, between isolation and connection. In one passage, he wrote, "The Aleutians taught us distance is an illusion. The ocean doesn't divide. It joins." The men who had died here had done more than defend a forgotten corner of the map. They had drawn an invisible bridge between continents, one built from cold, courage, and endurance. In an interview years later, a younger officer remembered Smith's final words before leaving the island. The real victory wasn't taking back the islands. It was learning how close the world truly is and how fragile peace can be. By the time Smith's ship departed for Seattle, the fog had rolled in again, swallowing the shore. The Aleutians vanished behind him, as if they'd never been there. Back in the continental United States, the war's end was loud. Parades, speeches, confetti. But Smith said nothing. When a reporter asked about his years in Alaska, he simply replied, "We learned that the world isn't as big as we thought." His words would appear later, quietly, in a Navy journal, one line among thousands of forgotten reports. The battle for Alaska did not decide the war, but it changed how America saw itself, forever. Because for the first time, Americans had looked across their own horizon and seen not safety, but nearness, a realization that would echo through every war that followed. From then on, no ocean ever felt wide enough. In official reports, it was a minor theater. For the men stepping off the transport in late 1945, it felt like returning from the end of the world. The docks in Seattle were loud with brass bands and paper streamers for Marines from Okinawa. The Aleutian men came down the gangway under a sky the wrong color, too bright, too soft, and nobody waited with signs. Their duffel bags smelled of diesel and wet wool. A clerk with a clipboard asked, "Unit?" And when they said, "At-2, Kiska?" he frowned as if they'd mispronounced Europe. Sergeant Tom Richardson wrote in his notebook that night, "We came back with frostbite scars, and no one asked where we'd been." He wore government-issue gloves in September because his fingers never warmed. The nails were ridged like old shells. In the VA lobby, a younger soldier with a Normandy patch told a story about hedgerows and tigers, and the crowd leaned in. When Tom mentioned fog and friendly fire and hands turning black in 30-knot wind, a man tapped his newspaper and said, "Cheer up, buddy. War's over." On the trains crossing the plains, people cheered heroes at every khaki coat. The Aleutian men kept their eyes on their boots. They had learned not to look too far ahead. The horizon on At-2 punished that habit. They were strangers to applause and to summer. One corporal pressed his palm to the window as cornfields unrolled like a promise. He whispered, "It has colors." There were no parades back home in the small towns. Mothers poured coffee and penciled notches on kitchen doors to measure how much their sons had shrunk. Wives tried to pull them into warm rooms and were surprised when the men chose the porch, where the wind could find them. In letters that never made the papers, they described the other casualties no medal mentioned. The man who slept on the floor under the bed because the mattress felt like snowdrift. The one who flinched at the hiss of a kettle because it sounded like a shell fuse waking. The sergeant who kept a candle burning all night, insisting the fog hated light. The army wrote it plain, necessary, but strategically limited. In the margin of his copy, a lieutenant printed 3 words and underlined them twice. What did we save? He could answer it, if anyone asked. They had saved a line on the map that didn't look like a line until you stood in that weather and realized Russia was only a handful of storms away, and the Kurils were closer than your memory of summer. Hospitals logged, trench foot, frostbite, exposure neuropathy. Chaplains' reports added, more softly, restlessness, melancholy, irritability at laughter. A medic from ADAC wrote to a professor he'd never met, "We teach the body to forgive. We have not yet learned how to teach the weather out of a mind." No one published that. At reunions, the Aleutian men drifted to the hall's back wall, where the map of campaigns showed Europe covered with arrows and the Pacific a fan of red lines sweeping toward Tokyo. Northwest, in a corner near the frame, the islands were dots like fly specks. A private traced them with a thumb. "That's us," he said, and chuckled without humor. "We're the punctuation." They carried photographs in their wallets the way others carried street Christopher medallions. A blown snow berm taller than a truck, a fox peering out of a drift like a sentry, a wooden cross with a helmet nailed to it, the name carved shallow to save the blade. They did not show the pictures often. When they did, a cousin would say, "Looks empty," and the veteran would nod. That's what we fought. Some tried college on the GI Bill and sat in lecture halls where the chalk squeaked like ice under a boot. A professor called the Aleutian campaign an auxiliary diversion. A hand rose in the 4th row and went down again. In the hall afterward, the veteran stood by a radiator for the heat he still could not keep and told himself that forgetting was a kind of mercy. He could not make himself believe it. Years passed. The men bought houses far from the sea and learned the names of different winds: Santa Ana, Nor'easter, Chinook. They kept a duffel in the garage anyway, a superstition against recall orders that would never come. When reporters called on anniversaries, they asked about Midway, Normandy, Iwo. The phone went quiet when a voice said at 2. "Spell that?" the reporter asked. The veteran spelled it slowly, like a prayer he wanted the other man to remember. On Memorial Day, a few of them met in a park that smelled of cut grass and hot dogs. They stood at attention when the bugle played, and in the long high note some could hear, just for an instant, the gale coming over Kiska like a living thing. One man reached for the shoulder he used to steady himself in that wind, and found only air. He let his hand drop. Not all of them grew old. The ones who did learned a peculiar peace, to wake before dawn and walk outside and feel the air on their faces and decide, today, to come back indoors. They rarely told the whole story, not because it hurt, though it did, but because certain kinds of silence had become part of how they kept breathing. In a filing cabinet in the Pentagon, a report yellowed, "Aleutian operations, necessary, minor." A clerk boxed it for transfer and wrote the destination in neat block letters. Archives. He did not see, on the last page, a clipped note from a weather lieutenant. Visibility, nil. Consequences, considerable. The paper folded over it hid the line for another decade. But documents do not stay buried forever. When they wake, they change what the living think they know. And in the years to come, the fog would lift, not on the islands, where it belongs, but in the records. What those pages revealed would redraw the story the men had carried alone. For years, everyone believed the Japanese attack on Alaska was little more than a sideshow, a desperate attempt to humiliate America after Pearl Harbor. The newspapers called it insignificant. The generals called it a diversion. But in the 1950s, when the archives in Tokyo finally opened, the truth emerged from the fog, and it changed everything. The documents came in through translators one brittle, yellowed page at a time. Maps marked with red ink. Memos written in precise brushstrokes. Orders signed by men whose names had once terrified the Pacific. Among them was one phrase that stunned American analysts. Control the northern sky, and you control the Pacific. The Aleutian assault, once thought to be an afterthought, had in fact been a cornerstone of Japan's strategy. It was not merely a raid. It was a curtain, meant to draw the eyes of the U.S. Navy north, away from where the real blow would fall, Midway. American historians pieced it together like a puzzle. In May 1942, Admiral Yamamoto had split his forces, one to strike the Midway Atoll, another to seize Attu and Kiska. The plan was elegant, deadly. While America scrambled to defend Alaska, Japan would crush the Pacific Fleet and open a northern gate to the U.S. mainland. But the Japanese hadn't counted on the weather, or on American codebreakers, or on the sheer, grinding brutality of the Aleutian terrain. The storm that swallowed their fleet near Attu scattered ships and silenced radios. The fog that cloaked the islands became both weapon and curse. By the time their soldiers dug into the volcanic rock, Midway had already turned into a disaster. What America thought was a feint had been a gamble, one that nearly changed the map of the world. Declassified intelligence reports from the 1950s show how close it came. A memo from Naval Intelligence reads, had the Japanese established permanent airfields on the Aleutians, long-range bombers could have reached the West Coast within weeks. Seattle, San Francisco, even Los Angeles, all within range of what the enemy called Operation AL. The Aleutians were never just rocks. They were the door to America's northern sky. Colonel Everett Smith, long retired by then, was shown the files by a young historian in Washington. He read them slowly, the way one reads an obituary. So we weren't forgotten, he said finally. Just misunderstood. Then, after a pause, we didn't know it, but we were standing between two oceans. The discovery rewrote not only history, but memory. Veterans who had been dismissed as the men who froze for nothing learned they had, in fact, defended the continent from invasion. For the first time, journalists began calling the Aleutian Campaign America's hidden victory. Still, the victory felt hollow. The men who had suffered there were mostly gone, their medals tarnished, their stories unrecorded. But the documents gave them back their meaning. The fog that had once blinded them now revealed what they'd truly done. A few of the old soldiers were still alive when the first public report was released in 1957. One, a sergeant named James Lowell, was interviewed for a radio program. His voice was rough from decades of cold air and cigarettes. They told us it was nothing, he said. A forgotten front. But I guess sometimes you don't know what you're saving until someone tells you 50 years later. In Japan, the surviving officers who had planned the attack admitted in post-war testimony that the Aleutians had been seen as the northern shield of the empire. One admiral, when asked why they withdrew from Kiska, replied, "Because the fog was not on our side anymore." That line stayed with historians, a metaphor as much as a memory. The fog had always been more than weather. It was confusion, secrecy, misdirection, the element that had hidden truth for decades. And now, piece by piece, it was lifting. Researchers in Tokyo found one last entry in a wartime logbook from the Japanese cruiser Takao. Dated May 1942, it read simply, "If we lose the North, we lose the war." They did. And yet, the men who fought there never saw themselves as the ones who saved it. To them, it had been cold, hunger, silence, a war without glory. But the files told another story, that their suffering had bought time, drawn enemy forces away from Midway, and changed the course of the Pacific. A.U.S. Admiral later summarized it in a classified report. Without the Aleutians, there might have been no Midway victory. The fog had not failure, but salvation. When that line was finally declassified in the 1980s, a handful of surviving veterans gathered in Anchorage to hear it read aloud. The hall was small, the audience smaller. The men sat in folding chairs, their hair silver, their hands trembling. One whispered, "So that's what it was all for." Another said nothing, just closed his eyes and nodded. Outside, the air was cold and gray, the same wind that had once howled across Attu and Kiska. It seemed to carry the voices of the lost, not as ghosts, but as proof. The Aleutians weren't just rocks. They were the line between fear and freedom. And for the first time in history, the world finally saw what had been hidden all along. Every year, the fog still rolls in. It curls around the black cliffs of Attu, wraps the mountains in silence, and hides the old scars beneath its white breath. The war ended 80 years ago, but the Aleutians never forgot. The wind still hums through rusted gun barrels. The moss still grows over helmets left where men fell. And every May, someone leaves a cross, plain wood, no name, on the hill above Massacre Bay. They call it the last church in the fog. There's no steeple, just the remnants of a chapel built from airplane parts. Wings for walls, propellers for beams. The story says American engineers and Japanese survivors built it together after the fighting stopped. They used whatever the war had left behind. Bomb casings became bells. Ammunition crates turned into pews. The sea took most of it long ago, but when the tide is low, you can still see the outline of the foundation, the ghost of a place where enemies once prayed side by side. In the summer of 2017, a small group of people came back to Attu. Two Americans, both sons of veterans. A Japanese historian from Hokkaido, and a handful of archaeologists searching for the remains of forgotten soldiers. The wind nearly tore the flag from its pole as they climbed the ridge. At the summit stood a memorial of gray stone, polished smooth by rain and time. On one side, English words, "To those who fought and died on this land." On the other, the same in Japanese. The American placed a hand on the stone. "My father fought here," he said quietly. The historian bowed. "So did mine." They stood like that for a long moment, not as victors or survivors, but as men trying to understand the same grief. "I suppose we both lost something," the American said. "Yes," the historian answered. "But maybe we both found something too." Around them, the fog moved as if listening. Below the cliffs, the ocean was the same deep green it had always been. The same water that had carried warships once, now carrying only the cries of gulls. From above, the island looked empty. But it wasn't. Every ridge still held the memories of voices, the rustle of uniforms, the echo of footsteps in snow. Researchers found fragments that day, a canteen stamped US, a belt buckle with kanji, a wooden rosary. They treated each like sacred relics. One archaeologist said, "It's not about finding the dead. It's about finding the end of their story." The fog thickened. It always did at dusk. One of the Americans whispered, "Maybe they're still walking here." "Maybe," the historian said. "But they're walking together now." Back in Anchorage, at the museum exhibit that followed, Visitors stared at the relics behind glass: corroded rifles, torn boots, faded photographs. A plaque on the wall read, "The Forgotten Battle, Remembered at Last." And yet, what moved people most wasn't the weapons or the maps. It was a single black and white photo, found in a soldier's pocket, showing two men, one American, one Japanese, kneeling beside the chapel cross they had built. No caption, just hands resting on the same piece of wood. A reporter asked the curator, "What's the meaning of it?" She said, "It means the fog finally cleared." The Aleutians had taught America something it didn't learn in victory parades or in textbooks: that freedom isn't granted by triumph, but by endurance. That humanity can survive even in the loneliest, coldest corners of the earth. One line from a veteran's diary, displayed beneath the photograph, seemed to say it best. "In the fog we could not tell friend from foe. Only later did I realize. Maybe that's how peace begins." Today, few remember the names Attu or Kiska. They are footnotes between Midway and Okinawa. But for those who have stood there, amid the fog and the wreckage, it is sacred ground. The end of one world, the beginning of another. The island is empty now. No soldiers, no watchtowers, no sound but the wind. Yet each year, the sea brings something back: a boot sole, a bullet, a prayer carved into driftwood. And each time, someone kneels and leaves a new cross beside the old ones. Because wars don't end in treaties. They end in memory. And for the men who once fought at the edge of the world, the Aleutians became something larger than a battlefield, a reminder that even in the bleakest places, mercy can take root and faith can outlast fire. The fog moves in again. The waves crash against the rocks. For a moment, the island disappears completely, swallowed by gray, by time, by silence. Then the wind shifts, and through the mist, a single wooden cross appears. The voice of the narrator fades, leaving only the sound of the sea, and one quiet truth that has outlived every uniform and every flag. The Aleutians taught us that even at the edge of the world, freedom isn't given. It's defended, in silence, in fog, and in faith. And that's how the war came home.